Yes, yes, what is up, producer friends? Today got a video. It's slightly a little bit more complicated, so it's going to be a little bit more structured out than a lot of my other videos where I'm kind of just winging it and talking. But hopefully it'll be useful maybe for some beginners or some people who just don't fully understand or grasp the idea of compression. But first, if you like content like this, you're a nerdy producer like me, then go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I'm here every week, usually on Saturdays or Sundays, posting random production videos. They're not always nerdy compression videos. Sometimes they're just me making beats or playing around in Serum. But anyways, let's go ahead and first talk a little bit about compression before I show you some examples. I think that'd be really helpful just to kind of like define some terms. And also explain that originally compressors were used because when you were in the studio recording before, we were recording into computers and stuff like that, say you're playing through a song and the drummer gets a little too excited at the chorus, right? And just hits the snare a little too hard and it's popping out way too much in the mix. It's distracting. You'd originally be using compressors to kind of squash that down a little bit and catch that peak so it's not going to just be sticking out in the final mix of the record. Now, that being said, today we have extremely detailed ways where we could go in and automate it for 10 milliseconds and it could just be insane. It almost seems like a compressor is obsolete, but I think it still has its place in modern production, and I still think it's really useful to know when you want to use a compressor because it's so much faster than going in and automating these tiny little moves and everything like that. And if it seems like I'm reading definitions off something, it's because I'm reading definitions off of something. But first, we'll start out with what is compression. Dynamic range compression, or simply compression, is an audio signal processing operation that reduces the volume of loud sounds or amplifies quiet sounds, thus reducing or compressing an audio signal's dynamic range. Wikipedia. So basically, making soft things loud and making loud things soft. But you're probably thinking,
can't you just do that with a volume knob?
Not necessarily, and that's what I'm going to show you here in a second. Also, another thing that's probably useful to understand is what is dynamic range. So here's an example of a waveform with a lot of dynamic range. You can see that it goes from a high peak down to almost nothing. And here's an example of a waveform with no dynamic range or very little dynamic range. You can see that it has a peak and then it pretty much stays constant until the end of the sound. And last little bit of talking before we actually get into some examples, the four main features of a compressor we're going to talk about. These are going to be your four main tools for getting the sounds that you want out of a compressor. The first one is going to be the threshold. The threshold is the level that the signal needs to rise above in order for the compressor to begin to work. Next, there is the attack time. The attack time of a compressor is the time it takes for the compressor to work when the signal has risen above the threshold. Next is release time. The release time refers to how long the compressor will take to relax the compression once the signal has fallen below the threshold. And last is makeup gain. Gain control at the output of a compressor. These are more just definitions that you can go ahead and reference. It's going to make a lot more sense whenever we actually get into the examples. So let's go ahead and just hop into that now. Okay, for the first example, I have a tom, and you can see here that we're going to try and mess around with a higher attack time. One thing I didn't mention in the intro was the ratio. Essentially, you can just think about this as the intensity of it. So if you're doing 2-to-1, that's not going to be very intense, but here we have 20-to-1, that's going to be very intense. You don't need to know the specifics about it, but it does help to just think about it basically as the intensity. So for this example, I have it set extremely high just so we can kind of hear the effects very obviously. And I have a hard compressor, a medium, a soft, and one with no compression. The only difference between any of these is the threshold level and the makeup gain level, which I will explain in a second. Let's just go ahead and listen through. I'll let each one play twice and switch it over so you can hear. So here's no compression. So you can see how by the time that we're compressing it super hard, it changes the sound quite a lot. Of course, there probably wouldn't be too many cases where you'd actually want to compress something this hard in a song, but for example purposes, it works really well. So let me explain why I have these compressors set up the way I do. We're letting through about 25 milliseconds of attack because we want to hear that initial click kind of sound on the tom. It has a long body to it, so I have quite a long release time to really just be pushing down on the sound with the compressor for a long time. And you can see that I'm changing the threshold to get different amounts of gain reduction right here. So basically how hard the compressor is pushing, you can see with this middle bar. Right here, you don't see a lot, as compared to in this hard compression where you're going to see a ton. Right? So that's how you can see how hard the compressor is pushing down the level. And how hard the compressor is pushing down on the level determines how much makeup gain we need to give or take away, right? So in this case, we're pushing down the compressor super hard, so that peak is poking through a ton. It has a lot of dynamic range. So we need to really crank down on this makeup gain, or it's going to just be insanely loud. See how it's peaking at the same volume as the soft one? Basically, that's what you're doing with your makeup gain. You're balancing it back down. So you're messing with the dynamic range and then bringing the makeup gain back down so that it's peaking around the same level. And you're not really changing the actual peak volume of the sound. This example is a little bit easier to understand when you actually look at the waveforms for everything. You can see here, I basically just recorded all of them. And our hard compressed waveform has a very quick transient and then almost nothing going on the rest of the sample. The medium keeps that quick transient, but you can see here that it has a little bit more body. Same with the soft one, a lot more body. And with our regular one, you can see that the transient is quite big and basically just fades out very slowly over time, whereas our hard one fades out almost immediately. So that's a scenario where you'd want to use a slow attack. I had high attack, same thing, but I'm going to use slow actually. Now let's look at an example for a fast attack. And let me switch that color over. So I have the exact same thing set up, but our compressor settings are a little bit different. You see, I have my attack pulled all the way down. So essentially what this is going to do is instead of accentuating that first little transient, it's going to squash that little transient and accentuate the body, everything that comes after that. You'll be able to hear this one. This one's pretty dramatic. So here we go with none compression, and I'll flip through them. So you see how it like almost elongates the sample? It brings out that body a ton. And if we wanted it to bring it out even more, we could bring the release time down. That's gonna give it less time for it to relax the compression. But for now, we're just gonna leave it as is and take a look at the recorded samples so you can really see kind of what happened to them. So you can see on our regular sample, looks just like it does. And on our soft example, it's starting to pull out this tail a little bit, and the medium one quite a bit more. And then the hard one, it's just insane. Like it literally brings it up in volume the longer it goes on. And you can hear it bringing up all of that weird little like floor noise, that little white noise towards the end. That's essentially compressor letting go at the very end. That's why it keeps getting louder. And the speed at which it lets go like that is based on your release time. So I have one more example on something that's not as drum based. So I just have like a little synth ARP thing going on here. And I have one with a fast attack and a slow attack. And we can see switching back and forth kind of how the compressor affects them differently with the different settings. So the fast attack synth is going to let a lot more of the body through. It's going to squash that initial click kind of transient sound a little bit and let a little bit more of the body through. And the slow attack is going to let through that transient and squash the body part of it. And this is getting into some kind of subtle stuff here, but if you're using it correctly across your productions, it can actually make a really big difference. And we can see here in the waveforms that this fast attack synth has these nice sharp little transients, whereas the slow attack synth has a lot more of a body to it. So essentially what I wanted to get across with this video was maybe some scenarios where you would want to use compression. And I think that some really good scenarios would be where you would want to use a fast attack compression would be if something isn't poking out enough or something seems too pushed back compared to other elements in your mix. You want to use a little bit of compression to bring out those first 20-30 milliseconds and make them feel a little closer to you without just cranking up the volume knob. That can really throw off the balance of your mix. So if you're really liking the balance, but you just need something to feel it like it's poking out a little bit more at you, a fast attack compressor would work really, really well for that. And inverse, if something is poking out way too much and you need to just set it back, but you really like how the balance of it in your mix, go ahead and use a slow attack compressor. That's going to just push that transient back a little bit in the mix without you having to just completely turn it down. Think of it as a sophisticated volume knob. Essentially, that's really all that it's doing is just messing around with the gain of your and the dynamic range of your sound. So hopefully that was somewhat of a comprehensive guide to compression and maybe how you would want to use it and when you would want to use it. If I missed anything in this video or something wasn't clear, definitely leave a comment, let me know, and I'll try to answer as many questions in the comments as I can or make an update to this video if I get some good feedback on it or something like that. Don't forget to like, subscribe, do all those things. And yeah, I'll see you guys next week.